The GPS shouldn't have brought me here. The streets didn't make sense. The signs seemed to mock logic, and each intersection felt like a trap. But what truly made my stomach churn was the blood-red sign at the corner of Ashwood and Elm. Do not fume on this street. I laughed nervously at first, until I heard someone hum, and then saw what happened next. The road ahead disappeared into darkness, the beams of my headlights swallowed by the thick mist that clung to the asphalt. My GPS chirped, its artificial voice calm, recalculating. Take the next right. I sighed, fatigue weighing on me like a lead blanket. A simple 2-hour drive home had turned into an endless series of detours and dead ends. The gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, the orange light blinking, like a warning I couldn't ignore. The next right appeared as a narrow, unmarked road. Thick trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches arching over the pavement like claws. Against my better judgment, I turned. The road twisted and turned, narrowing with each passing mile. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the saddle horn so tight. Steering wheel, a creeping unease, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. There were no houses, no signs, no sign of life. Then, in the distance, a faint light flickered. Relieved, I pressed the accelerator, the car lurching forward. As I approached, the light resolved into a street lamp, casting its glow on a single sign. Welcome to Ashbourne. The air inside the car turned cold. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I passed beneath the sign. Satunt, my headlights illuminated another, smaller sign at the corner of the next intersection. Ashwer Avenue. Do not hum on this street. A nervous laugh escaped my lips, though it sounded hollow even to me. Who would put up something like that? My gaze flicked to the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. A figure stood under the street lamp I'd just passed, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My heart raced. I didn't slow down. The next intersection loomed ahead, another sign waiting. The car slowed to a crawl as the next intersection came into view, its sign illuminated by the flickering, the glow of another street lamp. My chest tightened as I read the words, etched in peeling red letters. Elm Street. Do not step off the sidewalk. I glanced down at the curb as I turned, my tires crunching against the gravel lining the road. The sidewalk stretched ahead in uneven slabs of concrete, cracked and overgrown with weeds. It felt unnatural, too, clean compared to the decayed surroundings, like it had been placed there deliberately. I shook my head, trying to push the growing dread aside. The street was empty, and the houses lining it. You scared them were dark, their windows staring like empty sockets. The further I drove, the tighter the road seemed to become, the overhanging branches forming a suffocating canopy above. Then I saw her. A young woman walked along the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around herself as though shielding against an unseeing chill. Her pace was slow, deliberate, and her head tilted slightly downward. I rolled the window down just enough to call out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" She froze. Blood ran cold as her foot shifted, a single step off the sidewalk. The air itself seemed to shatter. The shadows at the edge of the road surged forward, twisting and writhing. Like living tendrils, the woman screamed, her voice echoing unnaturally before it was silenced. The street was empty again. My pulse thundered as the lamplight above flickered, and I realized the next sign was only a few feet ahead. Willow Street, do not speak after dark. The clock on my dashboard clicked over to 11:59 p.m. I turned onto Willow Street, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The eerie silence that had enveloped the town thickened, each second dragging out into an unbearable eternity. My eyes darted the dashboard clock, 12 a.m. The warning from the last sign echoed in my mind. Do not speak after dark. The houses lining Willow Street were different. Larger, older, with sprawling porches and overgrown gardens. But every window was dark, curtains drawn tightly shut. Even the faint sound of my engine seemed muted, like the air itself was absorbing every noise. I slowed the car, my instincts screaming at me to keep moving, but something caught my attention. A man stood on the sidewalk ahead, his back to me, his body unnaturally still. His hands were clasped behind him, and his head tilted slightly upward, as though he were listening for something. I rolled the car to a stop, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Hello?" I called out. The moment the word left my lips, the man's head snapped toward me, rotating far beyond what was humanly possible. His eyes glowed faintly, his mouth opening into a silent scream. The street erupted. Shadows poured from the houses like living ink, writhing and slithering toward me. Down the street, in the opposite direction, lights flashed like living eyes. The man was no longer alone. Dozens of figures emerged from the darkness, their mouths stretched wide. In agonized grins, their eyes locked on me. Panic surged through me as I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the pavement. The shadows chased me, their tendrils lashing at the car's windows, leaving long, jagged cracks. As I reached the intersection, another sign loomed ahead. Maple Drive. Don't turn your back. I couldn't breathe. The rules weren't random. They were alive, and they were watching. I careened onto Maple Drive, my chest heaving as I struggled to process what I'd just escaped. The cracks on the car windows, spider-webbed with every bump, but I couldn't stop. Do not turn your back. The rule echoed in my mind like a chant. The street was darker than the others, as if the light from the moon refused to touch it. Houses on either side leaned inward, their roofs almost meeting above me like an oppressive canopy. A thick fog clung to the road, swallowing the edges of the sidewalk. Then the growling began. It was low, guttural, and came from everywhere at once. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat as the car skidded to a stop. In the rearview mirror, something moved in the fog. A shifting, hulking shadow with too many limbs. The growling grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sickening lurch that the thing was following me. Ping! My pulse hammered as I gunned the accelerator, the tires screeching. The shadow didn't slow. It lunged forward, its massive form keeping pace with my car. Tendrils of black smoke lashed out, slapping against the back windshield, leaving thick, oily streaks. Ahead, the street narrowed into an impossible angle. I couldn't turn around. Don't turn your back. I swerved, the side of the car grazing the curb. The growling turned to a howl, piercing and otherworldly. The shadow lashed out again, cracking the Protean windshield. The sign at the end of the road appeared suddenly, its words glowing faintly in the darkness. Oak Street. Do not close your eyes. I'd barely made the turn, the shadow disappearing into the fog behind me, but my relief was short-lived. My eyelids burned, heavy with exhaustion, and now I couldn't blink. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my vision blurred by the effort of keeping my eyes wide open. The headlights cut through the dense fog on Oak Street, revealing only fragments of the road ahead. My eyelids felt like lead, every second a battle to keep them from closing. The sign's warning loomed in my mind. Do not close your eyes. The shadows here were different, slower, deliberate, as if they were testing me. Dark figures moved just outside the headlight's reach, their forms barely distinguishable from the mist. They lingered in the periphery, flickering like bad memories, waiting for a moment of weakness. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the engine whining as the car sped up. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out every other sound. The road twisted sharply, and the fog seemed to thicken, almost like it was alive. A shape darted in front of the car. My reflexes took over. I blinked. In that instant, the world shifted. The headlights illuminated nothing but an empty void, black and endless. My breath hitched as the road dissolved beneath me, leaving only the sound of my heart pounding and the faint, echoing laugh of something inhuman. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the start of Oak Street. The same sign stared at me, its letters now glowing red. The shadow figures were closer this time, their hollow eyes fixed on me. You broke the rule, a voice whispered, the sound curling in my ears. Try again. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the figures closing in. I realized then, there was no leaving. Ashbourne. Not for me. Not for anyone. Behind me, the next sign appeared, glowing faintly in the dark. Welcome back, begin again. Begin again seemed. The shadows grew bolder. They darted closer to the car, their skeletal limbs brushing the windows, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. I gripped the wheel, my pulse pounding, the world outside a shifting, Scarcely bearable by modern standards. Nightmare. The fog swallowed everything, the headlights revealing only fleeting glimpses of the road and the shifting shapes that moved alongside me. The clock on the dashboard blinked erratically, the numbers scrambling before settling on zero-time. I didn't exist here. Not anymore. My hands shook as I pressed harder on the accelerator. The engine, groaning in protest. Ahead, the sign loomed again, its words glowing like fresh blood. Welcome back, begin again. No, I whispered, the word barely audible over the growing hum of something massive approaching. From behind, the air vibrated with its presence, heavy and suffocating. The road looped, pulling me into its grasp like a snake tightening around prey. I passed Ashwood Avenue, its crimson sign as foreboding as ever. My heart sank, as I realized the rules hadn't changed. A tap on the passenger side window made me jump. I turned my head, and my breath caught. The figure, from the start, its head tilted, its hollow eyes staring. A single eye stared back at me. You broke them all, it said, its voice low and guttural. I screamed, slamming on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. The dashboard flickered, and the wheel twisted in my hands, dragging me back toward Oak Street. In the rearview mirror, dozens of shadowed figures followed, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The ho-hi creature beside me smiled. It's your turn now. Welcome home. If you're brave enough to share this, know that every word you speak could summon the streets to your door. Have you noticed how quiet your street has gotten since you started reading this? Are you sure your town doesn't have rules too? I didn't choose to join them. The cult chose me. One minute I was a traveler looking for a night's rest. The next, I was bound by their rules. Rules I didn't dare break. Not after what they did to the last person who tried. The GPS recalculated, its calm, detached voice cutting through the silence of my car. Turn left in 500 feet. The highway was supposed to be straightforward, but road closures had forced me onto back roads that seemed to wane endlessly into the void. When I took the turn, the pavement changed. Smooth asphalt gave way to cracked and uneven concrete, overgrown with weeds. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog that clung to the road like a living thing. Ahead, a sign emerged from the mist. Its letters warped and faded. Welcome to Hollow Vale. The name didn't ring any bells. No houses lined the street, no businesses. Just the skeletal remains of buildings long abandoned, their windows gaping like hollow eyes. The road narrowed, and the trees on either side seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the edges of the car, almost like breathing. When the lodge appeared at the end of the street, its faint light flickering in the darkness, I felt a wave of relief. My relief was short-lived. The building seemed wrong, leaning slightly, its wooden sign swinging erratically in the still air. Sanctum. Lodge. As I stepped out of the car, the hum grew louder. The air turned colder, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I hesitated at the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But I was too tired, too desperate to listen. Inside, the man at the counter greeted me with an unnatural smile. Looking for shelter? The way he said it made my stomach churn. Yet, I nodded. Behind him, etched into the wall in jagged letters, were the words, "Obey the rules or serve the sanctum." I didn't know it yet, but I had already begun to break them. The room smelled faintly of wax and mildew. A single candle flickered on the dresser, casting jagged shadows on the peeling wallpaper. I shut the door behind me, bolting it instinctively, though I wasn't sure. Why? The silence in the lodge wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, heavy, like the air itself was listening. My eyes caught on the list of rules neatly placed on the nightstand. The handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive. 1. Do not leave your room after midnight. 2. If you hear footsteps outside, do not answer the door. 3. Do not blow out the candle. 4. Attend the gathering at dawn. I laughed nervously, the sound feeling out of place in the suffocating quiet. Who wrote this? Was it some bizarre joke? But the memory of the man at the counter, his too wide smile, his unblinking stare, lingered. An unease crept up my spine. I sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion tugging at my body, But my mind was alert, scanning the room for anything unusual. The shadows seemed to move, stretching and curling as the candle flickered. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, but unmistakable, soft, deliberate, like someone pacing just outside my door. Pulse quickened as the steps grew louder, stopping directly in front of my room. A knock followed, light but insistent. "Hello?" a voice called, thin and trembling. "Please, can you help me?" I froze, gripping the sheets. The second rule burned in my mind. Do not answer the door. "Please," the voice repeated, cracking into a sob. "It's so cold out here." The shadows on the walls thickened, creeping toward the door. My breath hitched as the knob rattled. Then the candle flickered violently, its flame dancing erratically before settling again. It stopped, but the shadows didn't retreat. They lingered, pooling near the edges of the door like they were waiting for something, or someone. And in the silence that followed, I realized I wasn't alone in the room. The knock at my door came sharply at 5 a.m., cutting through the suffocating silence. I bolted upright, in bed, my body rigid. Long, warped shadows. "It's time," a voice called from the other side of the door. Not the desperate, trembling voice from earlier. This one was calm, authoritative, and chillingly certain. I hesitated, the rules running through my mind. Attend the gathering at dawn. Attendance is mandatory. My throat felt dry as I slid off the bed, my legs weak beneath me. I opened the door slowly, revealing the man from the counter. He smiled, his teeth unnervingly perfect. "Follow me," he said. The hallway was alive with movement. Doors opened one by one, and other guests emerged, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes dull like glass. No one spoke. They moved like puppets, drawn toward the same spiral staircase at the end of the corridor. I followed, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder as we descended into the bowels of the lodge, the walls damp and stained with dark streaks that I tried not to think about. The basement opened into a cavernous room lit by dozens of flickering candles, arranged in a wide circle. The air smelled metallic, sharp and biting. At the center stood a wooden altar, its surface carved with separate categories. Intricate, jagged symbols that seemed to shift when I looked too long. The man gestured for us to gather around the altar, his smile widening unnaturally. "Welcome to the sanctum," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Tonight, we are honored by your presence." The others began to hum, low and rhythmic, the sound reverberating in my chest. The altar seemed to pulse in time with their voices, the symbols glowing faintly. And then, the chanting began. The chanting grew louder, rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm that pressed against my skull. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, filled with the metallic tang of blood. My skin crawled as I stood among the others, their eyes glazed over, their mouths moving in unison with the guttural incantation. The man who had led us to the room stepped into the circle, his hands clasped behind his back. His smile had stretched wider, unnaturally so, splitting his face in a way that made bile rise in my throat. "The sanctum demands loyalty," he intoned, his voice reverberating through the cavernous space. "Tonight, you will prove your devotion." Two figures dragged something into the circle. My stomach dropped as I realized it was a man, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror. He thrashed weakly, his muffled screams lost beneath the relentless chanting. The leader turned to me, his gaze piercing. "Step forward." I shook my head instinctively, my feet refusing to move. The others turned in unison, their lifeless eyes fixed on me. "Step forward," he repeated, his voice sharper. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple, growing, darker, thicker. The air felt alive, vibrating with a sinister energy that crawled beneath my skin. Hands gripped my arms, cold and unyielding, dragging me forward. A dagger was thrust into my hands, its blade etched with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the flickering light. "Take the blade," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "Prove your worth to the sanctum." The bound man's muffled cries grew more frantic, his eyes pleading. My hands trembled as I raised the blade. The chanting swelled, pounding in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. "Do it," the leader hissed. The dagger plunged downward. The room fell silent. The altar glowed faintly, and the man's lifeless body slumped to the floor. The others began to hum again, their voices a chilling harmony that sent shivers down my spine. "You've proven yourself," the leader said, his grin widening. "But your service is only beginning." The shadows around the altar twisted, reaching for me. The leader's smile lingered in my mind long after the ritual ended. A grotesque image I couldn't shake. My hand still felt the weight of the dagger, though it had been taken from me. My clothes reeked of blood, its metallic tang clinging to my skin no matter how hard I rubbed at it. When the others left the room, silent and purposeful, I tried to follow, hoping I could blend into the background. But the leader stopped me, his hand cold as death on my shoulder. "Wait," he said, his voice soft yet commanding. "There's something you must take with you." He handed me a sheet of parchment, its edges frayed and stained with something dark and crusted. Written in the same meticulous handwriting as before was a new list. Rules for the devoted. 1. 2. Do not look into a mirror after dusk. 3. If you hear the bell toll, kneel immediately. Do not rise until it stops. 4. Do not leave the lodge until you are told. 5. The shadows are not your allies. Do not trust them. The leader's grin widened as he said, "These are your rules now. Break them, and you will understand what it means to serve the sanctum." I nodded, clutching the parchment, though my stomach churned. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but the oppressive weight of the room pinned me in place. Later, in the suffocating solitude of my room, I stared at the list, the candlelight dancing across the ominous words. Every shadow seemed alive, flickering in time with the flame. Then I made the mistake. I whispered the sanctum's name, barely audible, just to test the boundaries of this nightmare. The candle's flame turned black, its light snuffed out. My reflection in the window twisted, the face, staring back no longer mine, resonant, vibrating in my skull. I dropped to my knees, my pulse hammering. The shadows stretched across the walls, curling toward me, like hungry fingers. The bell rang again, louder this time. The last thing I saw before I shut my eyes was the parchment, its ink bleeding, new words scrawling themselves across the page. "You have broken the first rule. The sanctum is watching." The tolling continued, and I realized escape wasn't possible. The sanctum wasn't just a place. It was everywhere, and now it was in me. The bell stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, but I didn't dare move. The shadows stretched across the walls like spilled ink, twisting and shifting, as alive. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so close it felt like it was inside my head. "Run." I scrambled to my feet, my body moving before my mind could catch up. The door creaked as I flung it open, the hallway empty but impossibly darker than before. The faint glow of the flickering sconces barely pierced the shadows. The walls groaned, as though the lodge itself was alive, angry, and closing in around me. I sprinted toward the staircase, my heartbeat deafening in my ears. The air grew colder with each step, my skin prickling with an unnatural chill. The distant hum I'd heard when I first arrived returned, louder now, vibrating in my bones. As I reached the lobby, my hope flared for a moment. The front door stood ajar, moonlight spilling in. I bolted for it, my feet slipping on the warped wooden floor. But as I reached the threshold, the air shifted, and the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. A voice boomed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You cannot leave. You are bound to the Ivar, the sanctum." I turned, trembling, as the shadows pooled together, forming a massive twisting figure. Its hollow eyes bore into me, its mouth a gaping void. The parchment in my pocket burned, the words searing into my skin. "Escape is an illusion. You belong to us." I backed away, but the figure surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. And as I screamed, I realized the truth. I wasn't escaping. I was being consumed. Pass this on, but remember, those who share the sanctum's secrets might be the ones it comes for. Are you sure you haven't been marked already? Check your skin. The sanctum always leaves its scars. first rule was simple: never stand in the yellow zone after midnight. I thought it was just safety advice, until I saw what happened to the man who didn't move in time. I didn't want to follow the rules. I wanted to run. But now I know. Breaking them is worse than death. The station felt wrong the moment I arrived. The air was too still, heavy, as if it were holding its breath. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly, casting long, trembling shadows across the Lyceum. Cracked tiles. The departure board above the platform blinked erratically. Next train, 12:45 a.m. I checked my phone. Dead. Of course. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a few scattered figures. Too few for a station this size. They sat unnaturally still, their heads bowed, their faces hidden by the dim light. A cold draft swept through, raising goosebumps on my arms. As I stepped forward, a rusted sign bolted to the wall caught my eye. The words were faded, but their warning was unmistakable. Rules for safe travel. 1. 2. Do not board an empty train. 3. If you hear knocking from the tracks, do not look down. 4. 5. Never stay past the last train. I read the list twice, unease building in my chest. It had to be a joke, a morbid prank left by some bored local. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rules were meant for me. A faint knocking broke the silence, soft at first, but growing louder, rhythmic, like something was tapping, just beneath the platform. Then I saw it, a shadow shifting against the wall of the tunnel, long and serpentine, moving closer. Stay behind the yellow line, a voice whispered behind me. I turned sharply. No one was there. The knocking stopped, and the stillness that followed was worse. The knocking started again, louder this time, reverberating through the cold air like a pulse. I focused on the platform floor, but my gaze kept flickering toward the tracks. The yellow line stretched in front of me, its edges frayed and chipped, separating safety from what? Movement caught my eye. A man in a gray coat stood farther down the platform, dangerously close to the carré edge. Darkness of the tunnel. Hey, I called out, my voice sharp and instinctive. Step back. He didn't react. The knocking grew more frantic, like it was directly beneath him. My heart raced as I took a step closer, crossing the yellow line. Seriously, you need to... The air shifted. It became heavier, colder, wrapping around me like a damp shroud. The man turned his head toward me, his movements unnaturally slow. His face was pale, his eyes wide and blank, and his lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak. Then, without warning, a hand shot up from the tracks. It was long, gnarled, its skin gray and cracked like old leather. It grabbed the man's ankle, yanking him down with terrifying force. He didn't scream, he didn't struggle. He simply crumpled, disappearing into the darkness below. The platform fell silent again. The knocking stopped, but the memory of the hand burned in my mind. I stumbled backward, realizing too late that my own feet were now planted firmly in the yellow zone. A faint voice whispered from behind me, cold and familiar. Stay behind the line. I turned, but no one was there. The shadows seemed closer now, and the air felt thick with something. Unseen, waiting. The train screeched into the station with an ear-splitting metallic wail. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the tunnel itself amplified it. I stepped back instinctively, my shoes brushing the yellow line. The cold air around me seemed to grow colder, and my breath fogged in the fluorescent light. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the empty interior of the train. Each car was a ghostly void of pale blue seats, their plastic surfaces reflecting the flickering overhead lights. No passengers. Not one. My chest tightened. Rule 2. Do not board an empty train. The intercom crackled overhead, its voice distorted, warbling. All passengers must board. I didn't move. I couldn't. The platform felt safer, even with the unseen presence lingering behind me. As I hesitated, the lights in the station dimmed, and the shadows around me stretched. Board now, the voice said again, sharper this time. The train doors began to close. A figure appeared in the last car, its silhouette barely visible through the window. I squinted, my heart pounding. It didn't move, didn't sit. It just stood there, motionless, staring in my direction. Then its head tilted, an unnatural jerk that sent a shiver down my spine. The doors began to close and panic surged in my chest. My instincts screamed to run, to get on the train, to escape whatever was closing in around me, but I stayed rooted to the spot. The train pulled away, disappearing into the tunnel, its empty cars vanishing into the darkness. The platform felt colder, heavier, the shadows now unmoving. "You didn't get on," the intercom whispered, softer now, but far more chilling. I wasn't sure if it was angry or waiting. The platform was suffocatingly quiet, the distant hum of the departed train fading into nothing. The air around me grew dense, pressing against my skin like a heavy fog. I turned, scanning the empty platform, for some sign of life. Instead, I saw her. She stood at the far end of the platform, partially obscured by the shadows. Her dress caught the faint glow of the flickering lights, a deep crimson that seemed almost too vivid for the dreary surroundings. Her posture was unnerving, still too rigid, her arms hanging unnaturally at her sides. Rule 4 echoed in my mind like a scream. Do not acknowledge the woman in the red dress. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to look away, to pretend she wasn't there. But my eyes betrayed me, flicking back to her against my will. She tilted her head slightly, almost curiously, as though she could sense my attention. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Slow, deliberate, each step amplified by the oppressive quiet. She was walking toward me. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the air. "Please help me." My heart hammered in my chest. I clenched my fists, keeping my eyes on the ground. My breathing was ragged, loud in the silence, but I didn't dare respond. "Don't ignore me," she said, her tone shifting, colder now. Her footsteps quickened, the sound erratic, each step a harsh slap against the tiles. The air grew colder, my breath fogging in front of me. I kept my eyes fixed downward, my muscles locked in place, as she stopped inches away. Her shadow stretched over mine, long and twisting unnaturally. "You can look at me," she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "Just one glance." The laughter that followed was inhuman, low and guttural, reverberating through the platform like a predator's growl. I clenched my eyes shut, gripping the bench behind me for support. When I finally opened them, the platform was empty, but the air hadn't warmed, and the heavy silence lingered, reminding me she hadn't truly gone. That, far down the platform, a faint knock echoed from the tracks. Something was still watching. The clock on the platform flickered violently as it struck 1:45 a.m., casting jagged shadows across the cracked tiles. Each passing second. Rule 5 burned in my mind. Never stay past the last train. The silence was deafening, the only sound the faint tap-tap of water dripping somewhere deep in the station. I clutched the edge of the bench, my muscles locked in anticipation. The air felt alive, brimming, with an electric charge, as if the station itself was waiting for me to make a mistake. Far down the tunnel, the soft rumble of an approaching train broke the stillness. My pulse quickened as headlights pierced the darkness, their glow slicing through the fog that clung to the tracks. The train screeched to a halt in front of me, its brakes screaming like a wounded animal. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing rows of dimly lit seats. But something was wrong. The passengers inside weren't moving. They sat rigid, their heads tilted at odd angles, their eyes glowing faintly in the flickering light. The intercom crackled to life. "Board now. This is the final train." My feet refused to move. The figures inside the train shifted slightly, their heads snapping toward me in unison. My stomach churned as their mouths stretched into wide, unnatural grins. I stepped back, the overwhelming urge to run surging through me, but the shadows at the edge of the platform stirred, rippling as if alive. They stretched toward me, long, claw-like tendrils closing in. I said, "Yes?" The train let out a deafening whistle, its lights dimming. The figures inside didn't stop smiling. This was it, my last chance. And no matter what I chose, I knew I wouldn't leave this station unscathed. The train pulled away, its screeching brakes echoing long after the headlights vanished into the tunnel's darkness. Crawling at the edges, My chest heaved as I struggled to calm my breathing, but the air was thick and cold, like I was suffocating in a freezer. The clock above flickered, its hands spinning erratically, ticking louder with each revolution. Then it stopped. 1:46 a.m. The sound of the ticking didn't, though. It grew louder, faster, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I backed toward the bench, my legs trembling beneath me. That's when I saw it. The yellow line on the platform began to ripple like liquid, black veins spreading from beneath it. The shadows on the walls twisted violently, forming jagged shapes that danced closer with each flicker of the flames. Lights. Something moved in the tunnel. A figure emerged, crawling unnaturally on all fours, its limbs too long, its joints bending in the wrong directions. Its face was pale, featureless except for a wide, jagged smile that split its head nearly in two. It stopped just short of the platform, its head tilting as though it were studying me. "Your turn," it hissed, the voice like shattered glass scraping against my ears. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bench. The walls of the station seemed to close in, the tiles warping and buckling as the shadows writhed and reached for me. The figure stepped onto the platform, its movements jerky but deliberate. The intercom crackled to life one last time. End of the line. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing like gunshots against the tiles. The shadows surged after me, stretching across the floor, their cold tendrils brushing against my heels. When I reached the exit, the heavy steel gates slammed shut in front of me, trapping me inside. The platform lights flickered out, plunging the station into pitch black. The last thing I heard before the growling consumed me was a soft whisper. "Welcome back. Some stations have rules, they say. Some rules are there to keep them out. But are you sure your station doesn't have rules too? Have you already broken one? If you dare to share, know this. Each word whispered carries the rules to another platform, another station, perhaps even yours."